I just want to let you know that this webinar will be recorded. Recording starts now.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Constitution Hill Education Recovery Plan webinar. My name is Lebogang Marishani, and I'm going to be your facilitator for today's discussion. I would like just to start with the house rules before we commence with our webinar. And also just to welcome everybody and thank you for making time to join us on this very important topic in the time of COVID. We are joined by 57 participants. We have a panelist which is going to take us through a presentation but also be responding to issues that will be raised in the webinar. Just basic house rules. We encourage your participation through the chat box. So any input that you have as we go along, don't wait for a session to ask questions. You are welcome to post there. I'll be having my colleagues picking up on questions and input that we'll be putting forward to our panelists and open for discussion. Just a brief overview about Constitution Hill. We are a site of conscience that's based in Johannesburg, Braamfontein, formerly a prison complex, but also an old fort. We tell a history of the past, very turbulent past that we all know about South Africa's apartheid. But what's also exciting is that we house the Constitutional Court, and over and above that, we've taken a stand to be an activist museum to promote the values of human rights, constitutionalism, and democracy. And we do that through various programming. And this webinar is one of them. So we have educational programs. We do that through public programs. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Khaisang Satekhe, who will be setting the tone for today's webinar. To kickstart us on the discussion, I'm going to allocate about 10 minutes to the discussion, and thereafter the session will then be handed over to our panelists, who will then at that point be introducing themselves. Again, just to recap, I encourage that as the presentation is being done, give us your input and then we'll note those, and we encourage interactive discussions. Khaisang, it's over to you. Are you there, Khaisang?
Oh, sorry, my mic was muted there. Apologies. My name is Khaisang Satekhe, and I'm currently responsible for arts and culture and heritage programs at Constitution Hill, responsible for public programs, part of a team that is responsible for public programs, educational programs, exhibitions and events. And you're probably wondering why I'm on this platform. Well, I am a former educator. I taught at the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls for 4 years, and I was a visual arts educator. And, you know, I have a BA in fine arts, and I went on to obtain a postgraduate certificate in education, and I also did my master's. And my research was focused on curriculum studies, and I was really interested in finding ways of a critically integrated visual arts curriculum. So that's where my passion comes from and how I landed up in the education sector. So I would just like to introduce our next speaker who will be presenting. Her name is Sidiso Mukhodzi. She's actually a former graduate also of the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy. She was in the first group that graduated from the academy. And she's also now an educator at Southbourne Primary School in the Eastern Cape. She's very passionate about education, teacher training, and just finding forward-thinking, cutting-edge approaches to curriculum, to pedagogy, to learning and teaching. And she really wants to make a difference in the space. So I'm just going to introduce her. She has a presentation that basically covers some of the challenges that teachers and educators are facing during this difficult time of the coronavirus. She's spoken to a few educators and learners and found out what their current challenges are, and also we've also done a little bit of research to see where the Department of Education is at in terms of addressing these challenges. So the presentation that she's going to take us through now is really an overview of the challenges and some of the solutions that she is suggesting and bringing forward with the assistance of some of the educators that she's been working with. So I'm going to hand over to our brilliant young Miss Sitiso Mokgotsi.
Hello, everyone. Sure, that sounds amazing. That sounds incredible there, Kaisang. First of all, I think I just want to thank Constitution Hill for the back end, the support so far. You guys have been amazing. And also just thank you to our panel for joining us today. We know that it's taking time from your personal time, so thank you. And to all the participants that are here as well. I'm so excited to hear from everyone. So I'm just going to get straight into what we have been discussing so far with Constitution Hill, along with the other teachers as well. So I'm just going to get right into it. I want to see, is everybody able to see my screen right now? Can I just see a quick yes? Is my screen visible?
Yes, your screen is visible.
Perfection. Okay, so starting off, we know that the Department of Basic Education has their own challenges that they've been facing because of COVID, and obviously because of that, they've come up with certain strategies, they've made resources available, and there's also obviously news around what is their plan, what's happening, what are parents feeling, teachers, schools, etc. So we're going to be looking into stuff like that. We're going to go very quickly over the document. I don't want to waste people's time. So just looking at the challenges alone, the Department of Education obviously right now is faced with, first of all, having a lot of learners under state schools. That means that they have a
We seem to be having a little bit of a technical error. We seem to have lost Ms. Sitiso. We're just going to try and see if we can unmute her or find a solution. She's there with us. Sitiso, can you hear us? Sitiso?
Am I back on?
Yes, you are back on. Are you?
Yeah, I'm just gonna have to keep on checking my mic. I don't know what's happening. How far were we before I went off the grid?
We were not anyway. So I think you would just have to start from the beginning because we lost at the beginning.
Okay, all right, cool. Just please remind me if I go off again. So far we are. I was starting to talk about the challenges that the Department of Basic Education is facing, starting with the fact that we have about 12.4 million learners that are struggling, that are under the state school. If my numbers are correct, you have about 3,500 schools that are lacking resources such as water. So obviously these are problems in terms of how do we go back to school and how do we return kids to school. Added on to that, the department is now faced with about 962 schools that have been vandalized since lockdown began. That's a lot of schools for them to have to handle over and above the challenges that they're already facing. So far, those are the kind of the challenges. And now the biggest issue is with parents and learners and teachers are wondering, how do we go back? How do we go back without worsening the transmission of COVID-19? How do we go back without putting teachers, learners, and their parents at risk of COVID-19? So far, the department has come up with a lot of strategies in terms of how do we combat this? How do we not lose learning and teaching time? The biggest one being phasing in of grades, starting with grade 12s and grade 7s on the 1st of June. And I think every 2 weeks from there, I'm phasing in 2 more grades. And then over and above that is providing PPEs to all state schools. So all the schools that are under the department, providing stuff like masks, water, and stuff like that as well. Is my mic? Okay, is my mic still on? Can I still go on?
Siti, so you may continue. We can hear you.
Oh, awesome. Perfect.
Yeah, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, cool. And then looking at that as well is the resources. If you look at the department's online facility, their website, they have a lot of resources that are available, but obviously these are resources that are only available to learners that have access to computers and to the internet, not so much the learners that don't. There's a lot of obviously news regarding what's happening, regarding concerns from parents, from teachers, from trade unions about how do we go back. So far our solution was to, I'm going to go very quickly through everything. I don't want to waste everybody's time. So far, our solution was to phase in, starting with the grade 12s from the month of June, because we've lost about, I think, 4 weeks of learning if you use the 9-day timetable. That is about 42 days lost of teaching. So you're starting with grade 12s, phasing them in, seeing how much we can help them catch up, how much teaching we can catch up to ensure that they don't lose out on anything. And then another solution would be from July onwards to phase in grade 11s and 12s. This way we have enough space, because we'll only by July we'll only have grade 11s and 12s. So a lot of teachers will have a lot of space, and then we could try and use teachers that are already employed by the state. Use those teachers to be assistants. They'd obviously be involved as part of planning for the 2 grades to ensure that they know exactly what's happening, how they can assist with making copies, with making booklets, assisting with assessments and evaluations and stuff like that. And then over and above that, their duties as assistants would also be stuff like classroom management and ensuring that children know exactly what's happening and that work is being done. To ensure effective physical distancing and to lessen transmission, we would try and make sure that we at least leave to about 10 students maximum in a class to create as much space as possible, and from there on follow as many of the rules, not as many, actually all the rules stated by the department and the government to ensure safety. And then over and above that, to make sure that learners don't move around, but rather a teacher does. So the lesser movement, the lesser transmission is happening. And then from the 3rd of August, to try and phase in grade 9s, 10s, 11s, and 12s. But at this point, we would try to make sure that the learners don't go in all at once. Rather, we set a timetable. You can see this is a bit of like a proposed timetable. Rather, we set a timetable where the grade 9s have a day, 10s a day, 11 as a day, and then teachers and schools will decide what timetable suits them most, the best, to ensure that the kids don't go in all at the same time and then just increase the risk of transmission. When it comes to assessments, we will realize that at present, there's a lot of assessments for CAPS and not enough teaching, even under the norm. So perhaps we'd have to look into reducing assessments to ensure that we don't overwhelm them with assessments while we're trying to help them catch up as well. And then we could look at extending the examination period in December. Instead of closing in December so early, then we can close a little later on to allow more time to assess. And then in the interim for grade 8, for grade 4 to grade 8, we were trying to think perhaps radio and TV lessons would be more helpful right now, because we don't want to take everybody back at school all at once. And phasing them in every 2 weeks might also not work the best, because even at lockdown level 4, we realize that there's a lot of infections still. So then TVs and radios could allow us that grace to use their time for lessons. And then added on to that, we could try to encourage independent learning projects whereby we hand out a project and the learners get to do it at home. We hand out material, they get to do it at home. And then every once in a while, we could do check-ins through online tutorials for those that have access to online resources. And then perhaps when we get to level 1 for all our learners, then we could also try to now ease into assessments and evaluations basing on the independent learning and the independent evaluation that we've tried to do with project-based learning. But I think we'll hear more from our experts on the panel today. And also now a big issue is, what if 2020 is cancelled? Perhaps we could continue then with our radio and TV lessons. We could enforce that project-based assessments and evaluation where learners are able to still work at home, where every once in a while then the teachers can check on them. And also we are aware that teachers and schools already know the abilities of each child. So we could work from there next year to see how each learner needs to be attended to ensure that there isn't too much damage that has been done from missing 2020. And also implementing strategies like remedial classes, summer programs, winter programs, afternoon classes. This will obviously require a lot more teachers to be employed by the department to ensure that the present teachers are not overwhelmed by having to do normal teaching and then do extra classes. So that would be if 2020 is cancelled. There's more strategies. Another one that we looked into was to perhaps just phase in grade 11s and 12s and then just help them because they need to apply for varsities and colleges, but mostly the grade 12s. And then some of them need to also apply for employment. They need to finish the matric to be able to do that. So we prioritize those 2 big grades, and then everyone else we sort out in the following year through a remedial program where we have additional classes and additional support for our learners. Concerns regarding foundation phase, this is something that we need to look into because currently we know that nobody would want to take the kids back because as much as they might not suffer the most from this, they go back to parents. They go back to grandparents that already suffer from this and they interact with other people as well. And also there's the issue, are they responsible enough to not be at school and swap their masks and stuff like that? So there's a lot of concern there that we need to look into. And then there's also a concern regarding special needs learners. How do we attend to them and ensure that they don't fall behind? Learners with barriers as well. I think the best solution here would be to attend to them the same way we have, with care and with caution, understanding that they're not incapable of learning. They simply just have barriers that we need to attend to ensure that they have access to education as well. And the last thing that we had a look at was, is there a set plan for IEB schools? I think IEB schools at this point have their own plans that they're looking into, and I think it'll be exciting to hear from them as well, what kind of plans they have, and if these plans could perhaps even assist us as the state group to see where we could go. Yeah, that's about it. I think I will cover some questions as we go through. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Seito. I think that gives us a basis for a very rich. Thank you so much for the presentation, Seito. I think it forms basis for a rich discussion. I would like to now go to our panelists, and I'm going to start with Dr. Hlatswayo, who is a lecturer at the University of KZN. But he's also done a lot of work around transformation of the South African education system. Because I think what we've just heard are the challenges right now that we're faced with. But I think it's very important to also get a sense of, in terms of the transformation, where is it that we lacked? We're balancing health issues and access to education at the moment. And it's a very tricky balancing act. I'd like to put it to Dr. Hlatswayo to just touch on how far is the transformation and what does it look like at the moment if we are to say we go back to school. What are the challenges? In response to that, I'm handing over to you, Dr. Hlatswayo.
Okay, thank you so much, colleagues. Do signal to me if you're struggling to hear me or if you are having challenges. I think the system did log me out a few seconds ago, but I think I'm back on. Do indicate if I'm having any audio challenges. Transformation is a broad parameter that we are still using. And I think the challenge for us at university is that we've been looking at transformation purely from the side of the university in terms about decolonization, transformation, the experiences of Black working class students. And I think all of that is still relevant for your schooling regarding a majority of those vulnerable students that are my colleague has just presented on. They come from quintile 1 to 3. Those are your Black working class schools. They often have infrastructural challenges and where they are located. So for me, I think those are the challenges. So I think what the COVID-19 has presented for us is to reveal the inequalities that we have in the system, where depending on where your school is located and depending whether you're quintile 1, 2, 3, then I think for me, those are going to be the biggest challenges that we are still trying to grapple with, because those are the ones who, remember, they don't have water at schools. Most of those learners are reliant on the feeding scheme as their first meal of the day. In those schools, in terms of infrastructure, chalkboard, the pit latrine issues, the death that is still happening in those schools. I think without solving those structural issues first, as a precondition towards moving on and responding to COVID-19, I'm terrified, to be honest with you, regarding to what extent does the government have the capacity to respond and make sure that they fumigate and that the healthcare and the well-being of teachers and the learners are well taken care of. But first, we need to sort out the structural challenges happening in our public schools first. I think I'll end there for now, colleagues.
Thank you so much. I think I'd like to now bring in Tsulufelo Moyo in response to what's being presented. The independent schools, which we know as private schools, are assumed to have resources. They are assumed to, at the moment, be doing a lot of the online education, which in the public discourse has caused a lot of debate. Is it education, curriculum catch-up, or is it just enrichment? Can we be saying that we are fair to those that don't have access? Tulu, I'm handing over to you to unpack this for us in the context of independent schools. How are we balancing access to equal education in this context?
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. So I am an associate dean of instruction in a private school, in an independent school. And I think what we've really just been focusing on doing is trying to find ways to make education accessible to all our students within the online platform in a way that they can all have access to it. Of course, you know, we really do need to consider the fact that I work with a certain, being in a private school, I work with kids who have a certain access to this information, to this technology. And I do believe that definitely, you know, echoing the doctor's sentiments, there is a lot of structural inequalities in the education system right now. There is lack of access for a lot of our kids who require the same information and the same educational resources. And I really believe that as an IEB school, we're not necessarily sharing enough. I think all of us as schools actually are not sharing enough. We're not really thinking outside of the box. We're not really preparing ourselves for the next phase, because as a country, there's still so much catching up that we have to do, and we really just need to be thinking about what are the most accessible and creative ways to actually give these resources to our kids and to allow them that access. So I mean, looking at Western countries right now who are using radio as a platform, you know, that's something that we're only now looking into after the fact. You know, so many weeks of education have been lost, so many weeks of academic content have been lost, and only now, about 2 months later, are we actually saying, oh, look at what they're doing. We're now playing catch up. We're now saying, let's try to use this resource, whereas we were thinking very one-dimensional to say, let's all use online platforms, forgetting that not everyone has access to these online platforms. I think more than once on this platform that we're using right now, so many people have discussed the fact that in a lot of schools, they're still to this day, you know, struggling with the infrastructure. they're still struggling with resources like textbooks and stuff like that. And we're here saying that we can give them access to this education via the internet, and not actually looking at each individual families and each individual students' needs in terms of what do they have. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Tulufelo. I think what you've just alluded to is also just to reveal the inequalities in terms of infrastructure, in terms of data. But also you've spoken a lot and revealed exclusion of children living with disability. There's a lot that's not being done for that sector of education. I don't know if independent schools are specifically catering for that, but I'm gonna put this to Seito, who's done some of the work, to just tell us around your research, if you've revealed some of the challenges. The one that stands out for me is the issue of those that are using Braille. Those that are blind cannot access any education, whether you're using any other form of ICTs. Are there any interventions that you've come up across, and how do they work, especially in the public education sector?
Thank you, Lebo. Look, I think like Tulufelo just mentioned, we have a lot of catching up that we are yet to do in terms of having resources available for the learners that have to use Braille and stuff like that. There are currently not many solutions. We are yet to sit together as a team. By a team, I mean those of us that are here, as well as whoever is out there that may have the necessary expertise in terms of how we can access these children. There are currently no solutions yet. The department hasn't revealed what concrete plans or what concrete strategies they have. I think we are yet to hear from the Minister of Education on Thursday this week about what her solutions are going forward. So it's a bit difficult to try to cater to children that have extreme barriers such as blindness or being unable to hear, etc. But for the independent schools, I think the independent schools, so far, most of them have doing quite well with their online learning. Obviously, there are situations where you find that there's a learner at an independent school, although on their own, they don't have the necessary resources. I think that it would be on the school itself to try to cater to such a learner, because you don't want to leave that learner out because they could be on bursary or scholarship. So yeah, but for the state schools, as Tulufelo has mentioned, there's a lot that we are yet to do because we still have to catch up. And Dr. Hlatshwayo also mentioned that there's a lot that needs to be rectified before we can even think of implementing any strategies. The one thing that I was thinking would be perhaps to print out booklets. This is one minor strategy. We could perhaps print out booklets for those learners that don't have access to internet, right? We print out booklets for them. They could be left at their school. In a case where the school is too far for them to go fetch, then we can make them available at centers that are close to them, such as clinics and stuff, just so they can pick it up from a post, go learn from that booklet, and then we could try to find a way to access those learners without having to be physically present and without also having to use too much internet access as well. Thank you, Lebo.
Thank you, Seito. I think from the comment section, I'm picking up a lot of the questions around the issue of food security. A lot of the learners are from less privileged backgrounds. Most of them, their only hot meal, or even their only meal would be from school. In this current context, these layers have been revealed to say the issue of poverty, the issue of food security. Learners are battling with that. And with it, it also brings psychological issues. I read somewhere where learners were putting up posts to say, I'm stressed, I don't have access to food. The only meal that I could get was from school. In this context, and I'm gonna pose this question to you, Dr. Hlachwayo, to say, when we say it takes a community to raise a child or a village to raise a child, what are some of the interventions that you see could be working when we speak transformation?
Thank you so much. I think I love that comment because it's exactly what's happening. We are not saying that the COVID-19 has invented poverty in South Africa. We are simply just emphasizing that with this pandemic, it has just revealed and further exposed the inequalities that were already pre-existing in society. And those are the real challenges that some of our learners, that's the only meal of the day that they have at school. And you are entirely correct that telling them that, okay, the schools have closed, rightfully so, because of this pandemic, then they have to stay at home for their own safety and everything else. Then now you've deprived them of their meals. It is also a basic fact, colleagues, that we cannot ignore that even in such surroundings, you do find out that there's one grandma who's taking care of about 4 or 5 grandchildren, the dependents, right? And they supplement the pension that they receive with selling some sweets, selling amakwenya, and selling those other things at the police station, at the railway station, and those other things to supplement and feed them. Now, that grandmother has been cut off in terms of some of the supplies. That does affect schooling, and that has everything to do with schooling, because psychologically, nutritionally, and everything, the child and the grandmother are affected. So what are some of those things? I do know, for example, that in Soweto, there is one NGO that is working with the Department of Social Development called COPESA. They've been lobbying on behalf of working graduates, on behalf of those who are fortunate to still receive a salary, to try and organize food parcels specifically dedicated to those vulnerable population. Now, while they cannot go to those homes to deliver them, what they started utilizing is using your police station, using your local churches and those others as meeting points, ground points where they can be able to deliver. So certainly on the ground, our community members have been quite active in trying to make a meaningful difference. Neighbors have gone on now to try and provide at least that one meal to their next door neighbors, to try and make sure that even though they don't have a lot to offer, they can at least try and assist one another. And by transformation, those are the kind of things that we are talking about. It would be excellent if from the top, in terms of the Department of Basic Education, Higher Education, Social Development, together with the Department of Health, could come up with some of these solutions. But I'm so happy that your small community organizations, your community policing forums, your police and others, together with the churches, with the local churches as well, have been quite uniting in making sure that they get as much donations as they can to open food parcels to be able to deliver to those vulnerable groups, especially to those learners and to those family where the only meal of the day they used to get was from the school. And I think those are some of the challenges we need to start thinking seriously about. Yes, it's important to think about learning. Yes, it is important to think about delivering pamphlets to learners and making sure they understand. But without food, without psychological support, those things can potentially become meaningless. And I think those are the things that we speak about when we speak about transformation. It would be excellent if the government can jump in, but I'm so glad that your local community organizations, community policing forums, the role of the church have jumped in to try and deliver some of those food parcels. Thank you, Lebo.
Thank you, Dr. Hlachwayo. I'm going to also pose the same question to you, Tulufelo. Independent or private schools don't exist in a vacuum. What are some of the interventions that you get involved in to ensure that communities that you operate within benefit, especially in this time of COVID-19?
Thank you, Lebo. I think the one thing I really just want to touch on that Dr. Hlachwayo just spoke about is just the psychological assistance, right? I think that's a big thing that not a lot of people are really considering and factoring in, that you've got all of these kids who right now are sitting at home and they are just as anxious and they are just as frustrated as the parents who are receiving this work, and they don't know what to do with it. And a lot of the interventions that we're really trying to push forward are academic. They are how we're gonna, finish off the year, how we're gonna make sure that these kids have all of these educational things that they require. And we're not really looking at what is it that we can do as a community to support them psychologically or mentally and emotionally. And I think I'm really lucky to be in a space where things like social emotional development are really a key part in what we're doing for children. And that's something that we as a school are able to offer, to the community, to actually say, how can we assist you in terms of providing that psychological help that the kids might need, or psychological help that a family might need in order to get through these tough times. And we do offer psychological assistance to our students. We offer it to parents as well, who might require it. And one thing that I will say that we're not doing enough. I will be critical of the position I'm in. One thing that I believe we're not doing enough that we should do more of is actually be offering training and assisting and collaborating with teachers from all over. Teachers who are in schools that are struggling. We actually have the capabilities, because I do believe that the one resource that we have in abundance is the human resource, and we could be giving that more to teachers around other schools. We could actually be linking up and actually having collaborative spaces with teachers who might need to know, how can we assist kids who are going through such emotional situations, or how can we assist kids who might not know how to work independently from home. Because I think I'm looking at the thread, and a big thing that's coming up is, how are kids working independently? How are we actually assisting those kids further who might not even know how to do work by themselves, and how are we assisting those parents who might be looking at that work and be just as confused? So I really do think that one position that I think we as independent schools need to put ourselves in is a position to be more collaborative. It's a position to say, how can we actually assist you guys in other schools with whatever needs that you might have? Thank you, Level.
Thanks to Lufelo. I think what's come across from both Dr. Hlatshwayo and yours presentation is the issue of the psychological support. And this is where I'd like to bring in Edwig Chawira, who's a parent, who's had an experience with a child being homeschooled and how to handle that. I'm going to hand over to him to tell us about what are some of the skills that he needed to learn to handle this.
Okay, firstly, it's a she. I think I've heard quite a bit of issues. Can you hear me, firstly?
We can hear.
You can hear me.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Firstly, for me, my concern, to be totally honest, is that I'm hearing quite a lot of issues, which to me still sounds like, okay, this is going to be a problem. This is going to be a problem. I'm not really hearing finite solutions which are going to work for everybody, including public schools. So absolutely important is the fact that we do have structural challenges in our schools that prevent proper health management and social distancing. But we also have structural inequalities in our communities that prevent effective learning. So if you are in a high density suburb, you can't wake up like in your Santons and study because the neighbor is making noise, your mother is calling you. So obviously this crisis has crystallized the dilemma that policymakers are facing right now. Do we close schools, or do we not? Do we continue to close schools, or do we have homeschooling? So for me, I think the best public policy is probably to have a balance of the two. And the issue of phasing in for me worries me, because you eventually have a situation where you're exposing children to social ills of our communities. So unfortunately, unlike our private schools, our children in the high density suburbs, they haven't got space to say if they're social distancing or if they're at home, they stay inside the house. When they're outside the house, what are some of the things that they're going to be exposed to? What will they really be able to pick up in 2 months or 3 months' time, and not having faced some challenges in terms of what they face in their neighborhoods? So for me, I think we've got to assess how we can gradually phase them into school, but not in a long term, 2 weeks every time to phase each grade. So some of the things that we're not talking about right now is issues like hot sitting. How do we bring these children back to school in a hot sitting phase approach, where we probably split the school and have a morning school and have an afternoon school? So I worry that we get stuck in terms of we must bring 10 kids back this week and 10 kids back next week. But at the end of the day, what you're inevitably doing is you're just delaying the infection rate. But if you have a situation where you bring half the class or a third of the class in the morning and a third of the class in the afternoon, you start to have a balance in terms of having them in the classroom and being able to support them properly, because you can't support children at home whose parents, first of all, don't know what they're doing half the time, and secondly, they don't have the equipment to be able to be schooled at home. I have also noticed, unfortunate enough to have a child who is at an independent school, but the reality of homeschooling is that it's a culture. It's not something that you wake up and start doing overnight and you say, I'll give you books and you go and learn. So if they don't understand what you're doing online, they're not likely to raise their hand up and say, I don't understand what you're doing, miss. They will just pretend everything is okay. Or it's half the time they've got their earphones on, they're chatting to their friends. So that discipline that school brings is not there in any case. And remember what our schools are doing. Our schools are providing nutrition, like one of the speakers said. They're providing an environment that fosters learning. So we need to find a way of ensuring that we don't expose them to health risks, but at the same time, we don't leave them to a situation where they're in a worse risk in their communities. Some will get pregnant, some will tend to drugs, some will tend to alcohol. How do we prevent those sort of things without necessarily exposing them to COVID-19? But my reality as well is that we need to also be careful that we don't paint every situation with the same brush, because currently what we're doing is we're saying that because our communities are not ready, we can't go out there and start bringing children back to school. We need to say that how can we bring the children back to school in a way that doesn't expose them? Because in Africa, as we know, we're already falling behind in terms of education. Look at what Denmark has done. China has got the children back to school. Everybody else has got children back to school. And that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you, Ms. Chawira, and apologies for that agenda bender. Thank you so much for your input. We have one of our panelists just joined us, Mampo Langa. She is a curriculum and ICT specialist. I'm going to give her a chance to just tell us about her ideas around intervention in terms of ICTs. When we speak about homeschooling using ICTs, what are some of the challenges outside access to data, outside infrastructure? We've spoken about psychological impacts of it. What are some of the challenges that are there, and how is it that she thinks we can overcome them? It's over to you, Mampo. Is Mampo there? Okay, it looks like we don't have Mampo at the moment. I'm going to go back to some of the comments that have been raised on our chat box. The one recurring issue is around the issue of returning to schools, whether it's in a phased approach or otherwise. A lot of you are asking around issues of safety. How are we ensuring that the children are safe? That balancing act between health and access to education. I'm going to start with you, Tsulufelo. How does that look in terms of systems that would need to be put in place to ensure that we balance health and access to education when we think about going back to schools?
Sorry, I got cut off there for a little bit. I'm not sure if you can hear me now. Am I back on?
Yeah, you audible.
Okay, perfect. So I think definitely the situation about reopening schools is a tricky one. I do commend the government for working tirelessly to try to see what can be done. Firstly, for me it's a big it's a yes and a no, because are we ready? If I ask myself the question of are we ready, it's a yes or no, because we should open, because I mean we're losing, the academic year is getting lost, and we're so far behind already, as has been mentioned, and the gap is just getting bigger and bigger, and I think someone had mentioned that the need to actually for kids to be at school, it's a cultural thing. Younger kids require that cognitive development by actually interacting with other kids. So by actually not going back to school, we're doing them a disservice, because they need to be in those spaces with them. And yes, I know there's been studies about the symptoms in children showing very differently. They have milder symptoms than adults. But I think if you also start thinking about teachers in these environments as well, what are we actually doing for teachers to protect them? What are we actually doing for teachers to prepare them for this? And my no comes from that point of, I don't know if we're really all fully equipped to open. Not all schools, if I'm going to think about a school in a township, I'm going to think about a rural school, I'm going to think about a school in the suburbs, all of those schools have different resources. All of those schools are not going to be as equipped as the next to actually open. And it's really going to be unfair to say that one school should be safer than the other. That's in some way further deepening those structural inequalities that we've mentioned and brought up. Because if I'm going to say my child is going to an independent school, they have all the resources that they need. And then my child who's going to a township school, they aren't equipped, and there's 40 plus children in a school, in a classroom. How are we actually making it fair to each person involved? What is it that can be done? Because even if we phase in this week, 2 grades come in, this week 2 grades come in, is it really solving the problem, or are we actually just putting a plaster on a bullet wound that's just going to bleed out? Because ultimately we're still going to be stuck in the same position where we are still dealing with the same structural issues, and we haven't really found a solution to the problem.
Thank you. I would like to bring in Saito here. I think ultimately we will need to open schools. That goes without saying. And there's a question in our chat box that asks, how do we begin as a community, an activist community, how do we begin to hold governments to account? What kind of structures do we need to form to mobilize and begin to tick those boxes and say, these are the things that need to be in place? There's issues of PPE that are being raised to say we need to ensure those are made available. And Saito, what's your take on that? What are kind of the interventions that we can begin to think about when we say we totally agree we need to open up schools, but these are the things? going back to that concept of a village raising a child, us as communities, how do we do that?
Lebo, I like the last comment that you made about us being a community. You know, the one thing I've realized about teaching, and I think everybody's comments is reiterating this notion that teaching is a team project. It doesn't take the Department of Education alone. It's going to take everybody. It's going to take all the other departments. It's going to take parents. It's going to take teachers. It is going to take anybody that has an interest in learning and teaching in this country for us to come up with the solutions. I think our biggest issue right now as South Africans is we want to know what is the government going to do, what is the government going to do. But the big question for us all is what are we going to do in the meantime? While we are waiting for them to be accountable, while we're waiting for them to take responsibility, what are we as a team, what are we as a community going to do? And I think we need to start taking a little bit more responsibility on our sides as well, as neighbors, as parents that somewhat have an experience in teaching, as siblings, you know what I mean? I just look at myself back when I was in primary school. I was the child that needed my school to feed. I needed that meal at school, and I would be completely shattered right now. So yes, the question of going back to school is absolutely important. Kids do need to go back to school. They need to learn, and mostly the functional part of state schools right now, providing food for these children. We need to look into that. But what do we do in the meantime while we're waiting for the government to be held responsible and to take account? What are we doing as individuals in our own capacities? How are we helping propel the movement forward while we wait? Thank you, Lebo.
Thank you, Seidzo. Just to build on what you've just spoken to, there's a question that's come through to say we adopting a risk approach, a very calculated risk approach. And I'd like Dr. Hlatswayo in the background of transformation, but also taking into account that we now have over 500 schools damaged. How do we remedy or mitigate this to ensure that we realize the transformation that we want in this context of I know it might sound like an unfair question, but in this context of COVID-19, how do we ensure that all children have access to education?
Thank you so much, Lebo, for that lovely question. It's certainly not fair. It is a very much a fair question. It is a fair question. And I love what you are saying, because you're speaking about the hundreds of schools that have been vandalized in South Africa. The previous speaker spoke about the feeding scheme, the psychological challenges, the extent of poverty. I mean, we already know that 17 million South Africans are reliant on the grant system. That can be your marker, Auslebo, to give you an indication of the structural inequalities and challenges that we are facing in South Africa. Hence, I responded briefly on the comment section that we cannot keep using Italy, Denmark, the United States, the United Kingdom, China as our case studies, because they have far larger economies than us. They've got far larger resources than us, and they certainly have much better healthcare infrastructure than us. So that for me is not even a fair comparison. And the point, before I go back to the question that you actually asked me, the point that I want to highlight is that we know now that the COVID-19, right, affects your respiratory system, flu-like symptoms and all those things. However, we also know that there's a relationship between diagnosing COVID-19 and the number of tests that you've conducted. So far in this country, out of a population of about 56, 57 million, we've tested less than 300,000 people. We've tested literally less than 300,000 people. And so I'm not sure that the phasing in plan that the Minister of Basic Education will be outlining for us on Thursday, what does that mean? Because we already know from the epidemiologists and from the scientists that the way COVID-19 spreads, it spreads asymptomatically as well. In other words, that would be used as label, shedding and spreading the virus, even though you don't show symptoms and you are not even aware of it. Now, if you think of a schooling, a university, a church, a funeral, a wedding, that should rightfully and righteously terrify us all, because we're not testing enough. And that, for me, are one of the biggest preconditions for opening. yes, it is important that they've promised the hand sanitizer, they're going to be fumigating the classrooms, but are they actually testing for COVID-19? Especially because the biggest spread of COVID-19 is those people who don't show symptoms and they are not even aware. They may not even aware that they are shedding the virus. That for me, and I think rightfully for most of everyone in the country, has been that concern that we seem to be saying, let's not have a one-size-fits-all approach. Let's open the independent, let's open those others. But for me, there needs to be a relationship between, yes, the infrastructure is important, yes, the well-being, but what about the testing that we are doing to make sure that when we say not more than 40 in that classroom, you don't have learners who might have COVID or who can even potentially pick up COVID and send it back to vulnerable groups, like their pensioners, their guardians, their parents, and things like that. So part of transformation or trying to make a meaningful difference, and I think, Seitito, you mentioned this point, is not only holding the government accountable in terms of the expenditure, the amount of testing. Yes, the academic program is important, but surely, colleagues, we can agree with me that our children's lives are much more important than saving the academic program for the sake of saving it. And I think that for me is my biggest concern right now. We are grossly under testing, but we are looking forward towards opening up the classroom. And I'm already terrified for the learners' lives as well as those teachers that we are literally putting in those positions. I'll stop there for now, Oslib.
Thank you so much. I think we have come towards the end of our session. What we've done is to go to the chat box and we've summed some of the comments and the questions for our panel. And I'd like to give opportunity to each and every one of our panelists to touch on these issues. So there are questions around the Department of Education's approach with regards to consultation, food security, infrastructure, learning, that's the catch-up, psychological support, transport, and PPE. I know it sounds like a long list, but just to sum it up, I'm going to give our panelists a chance to just touch on this. How do you think going forward recommendations should be in terms of opening up our schools? And I'm going to start with Ms. Chawira. If you can just sum it up as a parent, from a parent's perspective, what are your thoughts around this?
So for me, we are always going to have structural inequalities, and it's not going to take 2-3 months to sort them out. And the idea with this is that how do we ensure that our children continue to be educated despite the fact that we have a crisis in our country? We need to be cognizant of the fact that this crisis might last at least a year if we don't find a cure for this disease. So if we sit here and we continue to debate that we've got structural inequalities, we are putting our children at an unnecessary advantage. How do we balance them going back to school? And I think the only way to do it is split the schools, give them days to go to schools. Don't let them sit at home, because that can be more damaging. And we know that in Africa, that the environment that our children are coming from is not necessarily conducive for them to sit at home. Going to school has been the best thing that can happen to African children. And let's make sure that they go back to school, but in a safe way where we're not irresponsible. But let's also not be defensive and say we're not from there or from there, because we need to learn from other people. We're in a global village and we need to compete like we're in a global village. Thank you.
I'm Lebogang. Just sorry to interrupt there. I just wanted to also just remind you of our 2 learners and a teacher. Maybe you should also just give them an opportunity just to share some thoughts on how learning and teaching has been affected. I think especially the 2 learners that we've invited on the panel. Thank you.
My sincere apologies. I didn't realize that you finally connected, but welcome to the discussion. What I'll do is to maybe complete this round of remarks, and you'll be part of that. I'm going to move next to Tsulufelo. If you can also just touch on those points before we move to the next speaker.
Thank you, Lebo. I think that was quite a extensive list that you mentioned there. So I'm just gonna maybe just zoom into one part of it, which I feel very passionate about, and I feel like this is really where we could actually just amend a lot to support students. So just looking at the actual CAPS document, right? That the CAPS document is quite a very detailed document, and I think the one critique I have of that document is just the pacing, as well as just the focus on assessment. Right now, there's a lot of talk going back to getting kids back in the school and getting them to catch up on all of these things, but there's also so much focus on assessing kids and not actually teaching them and educating them. And yes, it's important to get them back to that space where we're able to teach them, but I think this running around that the government is doing in order to say how are we supporting them academically, where you're putting out a document that is literally based on teach to assess, and not teach to teach. Then you have kids who are stressed and teachers who are stressed because we can't assess them to see what have they actually learned, what is actually going on, and teachers can't use this. They don't use that information to actually decide how to teach. And this then builds this big gap between the kids that we've mentioned, the kids with special needs, the kids who require that one-on-one, more individualized attention. We aren't also tackling how are we supporting them, how are we closing that gap, because a lot of what I've heard, the vague information that comes from the VBE, it's always linked to we need to open schools, or how are we going to keep learning going on, but we're not actually zooming in on what curriculum are we using and how we're actually amending it to come into our current climate and actually support the kids with what's happening in the world right now. It's been around for years, but nothing has changed on it, and we're not looking at the fact that this is our new normal, and this is what we need to start doing to support our kids. And I really think that it's so important to factor in the moving forward and the innovative way of thinking that so many young people have and so many young teachers have, and start implementing it into this document that we want teachers to be using. Thank you, Lebo.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I think learners are an integral part of this discussion. And on that note, I'd like to invite Dimpho Bianca. If you can just share with us, how has this whole pandemic impacted on you? And what is it that you'd like to see in a case where you are to return back to school? Bianca? Bianca, are you here?
Bianca, please unmute your mic on your side.
So her full name is Dimpho Bianca. Is she with us?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there we
Hi,
go.
Bianca. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm so sorry for the technicalities. Basically, to just share my sentiments about how I feel, how the pandemic has been treating me thus far. I think I just share the same sentiments with the panel to just say that this COVID-19 has really highlighted the shortcomings that we have generally as a country, but particularly looking into the education sector. It has just highlighted some of the constraints that we have, right? So basically looking into how basically state schools actually move into a better modernized sort of education, right? Making education accessible out of the schooling environment, right? So basically on my side, I speak on a point of view of a young individual, a young people rather, who comes from a state school, public school, who depends on like learning in the classroom, right? So I don't have like access to data. I don't have access to a better phone or a laptop for me to actually indulge in online learning. So learning in and of itself for me has been actually me self-disciplining myself and trying to learn by myself. Because I think you need to understand that because I'm in matric, there's a lot of things that I need to actually cover, right? So because of like I've been limited to having just only my books, not actually having rather access to better internet, to your YouTube, to tutorials that are done. It's been a really a big problem, and I think I speak to vast majorities of people that are out there in remote areas of South Africa, in unprivileged societies where learning in and of itself for them depends on them being in the classroom. So it has been really a much a hectic thing for me, and actually to look into how my parents on the other hand have been affected, right? So because we live in I live in an environment where my parents are not that actually schooled or know more about online learning, or not online learning, and actually homeschooling. So like my mother doesn't even know how to actually wake me up and say, Dimpo, go and do your schoolwork, right? So it's a bit of a constraint because those things are not accessible to us as individuals in the public sector, in public education facilities, but those things are only accessible to individuals or kids in private IUB schools. So it's been a really hassle. It's been very difficult for us, right? And I think I just speak for the vast majority, as I've been saying, right, to say that there needs to be better calls for the government to actually ensure that we actually provide better facilities and better equipment to actually help learners to learn in and outside the classroom. I think it's important that we understand that learning outside the classroom actually prepares one for the general life they're going to face, right? So with us in the public schools, we're only used to the normative way of learning, right? Learning in with the textbook, learning with a teacher, you understand? So because of COVID-19, the learner and teacher engagement has been lost in and of itself. So it has really affected us because we don't have like your smartphones, we don't have laptops. And if I could even tell you how hard it was for me to actually get this phone, to actually get this data to actually be part of this panel, you would really be shocked. So these are some of the stories that ordinary kids that come from remote, townships, that come from underprivileged societies have to go through on a daily basis. And also the issue of food security, as the other panelists have alluded, right? So kids in a every day actually trying to understand where they're going to get their next meal because they only depended on the feeding scheme program in their schools. So those are some of the issues that COVID-19 in and of itself has actually showed to us and highlighted. And I think it's important that we have such platforms where we're able to engage with decision-making bodies. We're able to actually debate on a way forward. But basically on my sentiments, COVID-19 has not been treating me well, so to speak, in terms of my academics. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimpo. I can imagine how this is impacting on you. Yeah, it is a difficult time. I'd like to give opportunity to another learner, Tanya Raza, to also share with us how has this impacted on your education. Tanya Raza, it's over to you.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
You audible, go on.
Okay, thank you. So I think fundamentally what the issue with this entire pandemic has been is that generally the voice of the youth has been overlooked to a massive extent. So I think opportunities like this are really valuable to actually be able to share our voices and our opinions on issues like this. So as someone who's at a private school currently, I think it's been incredibly valuable to share in an online schooling experience. But I think the issue is fundamentally with the entire pandemic is that we've ignored a fundamental principle of education, and that's that no one should be left behind. So I think that a lot of the children from government schools have been left behind in this process, and not enough has been done to actually ensure that these people have gotten the adequate education that they've needed and that these learners have been included in the process of continuing their schooling. But I think we've talked about structural inequalities for 2 months now, and that hasn't gotten us anywhere. Yes, these inequalities do exist, but I think it's time that we ought to start looking at solutions that are simple and could help these learners to actually get somewhere with their education and actually help them in terms of uplifting our communities. And private schools ought to play a role in that as well. So I think one of the things that no one has thought of is speaking to mobile data providers and actually asking them to provide free mobile data for children at government schools. We haven't thought about how we can increase the radio programs to make sure that these people have more access to actually getting education and being able to continue with their schooling. I think at the end of the day, what the problem has become is that the race to get back to school has sort of become a token of like our progression against COVID-19 and how well we're doing. And we're using it as a measure of where our country has come in terms of the fight against the virus. But rather, we're not really thinking about what the youth are currently feeling right now and how the youth haven't been looked at and we've virtually been ignored. Because to speak for myself, my concern isn't necessarily how we're going to overcome the pandemic in its entirety, but it's rather how I can get back to school quickest, how I can start learning quickest, and how we're going to be able to ensure that not just children at IEB schools and schools that are lucky enough to have resources can go back to school, but rather looking at how every single child in this country can go back to school and is able to actually continue with their education. And I think until we get to a point where we're able to pose effective solutions that are helpful to every single learner, we haven't done enough and we won't be doing enough for quite a long time. We're going to have to live with this virus for over a year until a cure is found. Until then, life isn't necessarily going to go back to normal. But I think to that extent, then we need to start thinking about how we as a community can come together past the divisions of how we have structural inequalities and how there's discrimination and how there's issues that affect everyone, and think about how we can come together as a community to make sure that everyone has a voice and to make sure that everyone is getting the education they deserve and the education that they are entitled to under our Constitution.
Thank you, Dimpo and Tanyaraza. Thank you so much for your input. I'd like to bring in Ms. Musheche. And from an educator's perspective, if you can share with us, how is it that we can begin as educators, as teachers, to support learners? Because I think from the learners, what comes through is their voices being left behind. How do we begin at schools to create those forums where we do check-ins with them, where we support them psychologically? Ms. Musheche?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible. You can go on.
Okay. First and foremost, I don't think our country is ready yet to open schools for learning. Previous speaker spoke of countries like Denmark, UK having opened, in China, especially China. China to me, I think that country has been ready way beforehand. I think during the beginning of their pandemic, they were preparing their schools to reopen. A friend of mine in there tells me that learners, when they get to the gate, they throw their masks they come from home with in the dustbin, and they get fumigated and get a new mask to enter into the school building with, which we don't have. I don't think our country can do that. Then currently, I started working with my kids online, that is on WhatsApp, on the 31st of March. I had only a few learners who were online. Then we had to be sending work on school website. And we see that it's only a few who are able to do that. For me to check that my learners are doing work, I ask them to send me the activities I gave them on WhatsApp, and I give them a deadline as well as cut-off time. I get to see who is active. You can see that it's only a few, majority aren't. I come from a public school with a lot of underprivileged children. So most of them are not up to date with what other learners are doing right now. Speaking of infrastructures, like most of our of the audience are saying, it is true. We don't have the infrastructure, and back at home, most kids do not have the support they need. Their homes are not conducive for them to study. There is going to be actually it's a long road that we are going to partake. Life matters. Like somebody said, we value life. If the curriculum or the year is to be put aside, I understand 1976 it happened. And people after that, 2-3 years, they went back to school. Something like that can happen again. Matrix, yes, they can go back to school, provided the schools meet all the standards. Somebody suggested of opening boarding schools to accommodate the matric. I don't know how many boarding schools we have and how many matriculants we have who can be in those schools, so that at least they finish the work. I was invited by the National DBE to draft the ATP for senior phase. That's what I was given. And we drafted based on different scenarios. We got rid of some content that we need to use in the following year. And with like the previous ladies were showing us that exams, mid-year exams will be scrapped off. Then June, July as holidays and September holidays will have to be utilized for learning and catching up. Then we also drafted workbooks. These workbooks are to be given to schools, all schools, so that all learners are at the same level. They are learning the same thing, they're doing the same thing, they're catching up the same thing. But if we are not to open schools and the workbooks are to be delivered, how sure are we that the work is going to be done? If the learners are doing the work in the workbooks, how are the books going to get to the teachers to mark or to assess the work that the learners are doing at home? We really need to work together. Parents have to be involved. Teachers are doing their best, but you also see that in public schools, not all teachers are giving schoolwork because they don't have money for the debt. They tell you, I don't have a smartphone. I don't have data. If I even give them now, the department is saying when we go back to school, we have extra hours. So why suffer now? Better I suffer when we go back to school, when we leave school at 6 p.m. So it's really a big challenge we are facing.
Thank you so much, Ms. Musheche, for sharing. It does look like we had problems even before this. As all speakers have said, this is just revealing all the layers of our challenges. And I'm gonna bring in Seito here in your closing remarks. Given what's being discussed here, what's your take in terms of moving forward? How do you see us going back, more specifically in the public education sector? What are the interventions that you think need to be in place to ensure that we balance the access to education and the health issue?
Thank you so much, Lebo, and thank you so much to everyone that has asked questions, that has contributed as well. It's really been amazing and enlightening as well. You know, you think you have a plan up until you hear from everybody and you're like, okay, I need to have a relook at this. So thank you so much to everyone. I think so far the first thing, and I've suggested this before, is we need to work together first things first as parents and teachers. So we as a team need to do that. And then perhaps the more we do that, the more we come together with solutions and ideas, the more we can put pressure on the department to act accordingly and to come up with solutions that would benefit all South African children. And then secondly, I think we having to hear from the minister on Thursday, we will hear how clearer or how much clearer the plans are coming. And we might need to have another conversation post that to say, hey, do we agree with this? What do we do now? But in the meantime, what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from everybody is the protection of our children is very important. So we need to prioritize their lives first before we can even start thinking about how much learning they have to do. And then there's a psychological issue that we need to have a look at as well. I read an article somewhere where I heard that they are deploying social workers into communities. Perhaps that could assist as well. From the side of a teacher, I'd like to agree with what the previous teacher was mentioning as well, with having to work with WhatsApp and stuff like that. I'm currently working from WhatsApp with my learners as well. It's a bit difficult, and there's a lot of personal contact that I have to put in order to make sure that I access those children that are not able to. So once a week or a couple of times a week when I've uploaded work, I see that, okay, there's a couple of learners that haven't done work. I need to put in my own data, own airtime to call, to check in. Are you okay? How can I assist what's happening? And it's taken a lot of not only financial strain, it's taken a lot of emotional strain for myself as a teacher. So teachers in that regard need as much support as possible as well. And I also like to agree with the person that said we need parents in this. We need their input. Realizing though that parents are also struggling. A lot of people are going back to work now. So, and now it's a matter of I'm at work, my children have to learn at home. I don't even have a nanny. How do I balance? How do I make sure that my children are learning while I'm busy trying to earn an income to ensure that we continue living? That being said as well, I really hope that soon enough the department will distribute the resources that they need to. So the testing kits, the PPEs. We need to also do stuff like track your movement to ensure that our children haven't been in areas that are overly exposed. We need to take temperatures on a daily basis. We need to be very cautious. For example, if a child starts coughing, you need to just realize that, hey, maybe you need to look at that person. But also keeping in mind that a lot of children will be asymptomatic. They will be. So we need to be super careful and also think about the many of them, particularly in state schools, that go back to grandparents. Those are the people that are more vulnerable. That go back to sick parents that are vulnerable. And then additionally, as well, as I said before, this is not only going to take the Department of Education, it's going to take other departments as well in terms of distributing food, making sure that the children that depend on feeding schemes are fed, adding on, during this pandemic. It needs to be everybody coming in. When you look at issues of data, telecoms need to assist us. They can't sit there and pretend like they don't see what's happening. They're not losing business from this. So they need to start to work with us as parents and teachers in terms of lowering rates. Data rates in South Africa are very expensive. It's expensive to buy airtime. It's expensive to buy data in South Africa currently. So our telecoms businesses need to look into that. How can they assist the community? Businesses need to look into their community outreach. What are they doing to ensure that people are okay? What are businesses doing? Not just the department. It is not enough to say department do something. I think that is what we are learning right now, because COVID has only exposed that it is not enough for the department. It's really not enough for us to wait on them to come up with solutions, or to expect them to bring forth working solutions for our children. We need to work together. We need to unite as South Africans to put the pressure to come up with solutions that will work for our children in the village, in the township, and in suburbia as well. Thank you so much to everyone yet again, and thank you, Lebo.
Hi, Lebo. Please unmute on your side.
Okay. Thank you so much, Seito, for your input. I was just looking at our chat box, and I think participants are screaming for solutions, interventions. And thank you so much to the panelists for touching on those and sharing what your thoughts are. I'd like to bring in Dr. Hlajwayo on this. To now say we are, yes, a young democracy, but in this context, since COVID-19 has revealed so much inequality, so much that still needs to be done, what's your thinking in terms of what needs to happen, that we need to do as a country to accelerate transformation? In your closing remarks, can you just touch on that?
Okay, thank you so much, Auslebu. And I completely agree with the two learners. I think they summarized things brilliantly for us. And I agree, I think it was Tanya who mentioned this. I completely agree with her that, yes, we know the structural inequality is there, but there are also some things that we can do. And I think Seitiso also mentioned that. So, of course, there are two groups of things that we can do. There's the macro one, then there's the micro one. The macro one are the big structural issues that we've already talking about, from the PPE to the making sure that there's adequate testing when learners come into the classroom, making sure that the teachers are also protected, making sure that at least the number from about 200,000, 250,000 tests that have been done at least increases to about 1 million or 2 million per month, so that it can meet up with the size of the population. So there's the bigger things, of course, that can be done. But I like Saitiso, I enjoy the little things that are on our hands. And I think I like what the learners said about the data telecommunication thing. Yes, the learner has mentioned that. I think it's Dimple. She's already lovelily mentioned the challenges of data, accessing data. And if that is a challenge, you can imagine that robs her from being offline. So I do strongly believe that those should be one of the things that we are making a noise about, making sure that for online learning material, there should be no data charged attached to that. So I think that can simplify and at least give us that level playing field. Of course, we as the parents and the guardians need to come to the party. I do understand that schooling offers that community of learning, the support, teachers who are trained about teaching and learning, and they know how to do it. But I think we as parents, we as guardians need to come to the party to instill that strict discipline that is required, whereby at least we know that from this hour to that hour, let's do this task, let's do this work, let's make sure that we catch up with our children as well, because I think that is in our hands. That is something that we can personally control in our own surroundings. I do want to flag some of the amazing work that is being done by the Community Policing Forum, some of the NGOs, some of the religious the organizations, cultural organizations, and others as well, who've started by that the drive towards food parcels and other materials that those in the vulnerable groups have started providing. So I think those are some of the little steps that we can do. But definitely in terms of the data one is very, very important. And we as the parents, we can't always blame the government, but I think we need to be strict as the parents ourselves, as the guardians ourselves, to make sure that, did you do your homework? Did you catch up on your material? Did you do your reading? Let's make sure we do this. We can't keep blaming the government. We can't keep saying the school is out, is closed, but we need to at least play an important role for ourselves. And I agree with one of the comments that are coming around the importance of creating some sort of a portal. I know we've created it at university where we have one database where your readings and all the online material, you can access them. Maybe that's one of the things that the Department of Education can create, that is data free, where I know that if I want to learn with my daughter around life sciences, there is somewhere where I can get all those materials and how I can do that. So I think those for me are the most important one. Thank you, Ausleb.
Thank you so much. We still have questions streaming in, and I think we can have a debate as long as we can. This is a very contentious issue, but unfortunately it has to come to an end of the webinar. I am going to hand over to my colleague, but before I do that, I'd like to thank our panelists for agreeing to participate in this and for providing us a robust engagement. To our participants, thank you so much for engaging on the issues and also contributing. I'm handing over to Zui, who is going to make an announcement about future webinars. From me and Constitution Hill, much, much appreciated, and there will be more of these webinars coming. Thank you so, so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lebo. Good afternoon. I'm Zubia Ramashia from Constitution Hill. I am with the Education Department, and I would like to just pass our gratitude to all the panelists, to the facilitator, and to the audience for honoring this invitation. I have to say that this was amazing. We have got quite a task ahead of us as Cornhill, as well as all these other parties, including yourselves as our audience and the panelists. And as Constitution Hill, we'll be hosting more lehutas, more dialogues, more of these webinars going ahead, because we want to position ourselves as an entity which stands to make sure that we use these different platforms to explore solutions to our different issues that we might be facing as communities and as South Africa as a whole. So please keep in touch. Follow us on our social media platforms. We will be definitely bringing more of these webinars so that we can explore all these issues as a country amid this COVID-19 pandemic or crisis. Thank you very much. Have a great day further.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.